Our first speaker is going to be Devin Chafee, who is the Executive Director of the New Hampshire chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. And she's going to discuss the ACLU's concern about the issue. The second speaker is going to be Professor Tracy Macklin, who's a professor of law and the Joseph Lipset Research Scholar at the Boston University School of Law. Professor Macklin has deep expertise and experience in the area of criminal procedure with a special focus on issues of search and seizure, and we're really pleased to have him here today. And then finally, David Mara, who is the interim chief of police in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and retired last year after 29 years serving as the chief of police in the city of Manchester. And Chief Mara is also an attorney and a member of the New Hampshire Bar Association. We are hoping, too, that Professor Ronald Sullivan, who's a clinical professor of law and the director of the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School, we're hoping that he will be joining us. I suspect, I understand that traffic northbound on Route 93 has been brutal in recent weekends, and I suspect he may be caught in traffic, so fingers crossed there. So thank you very much, Devin.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Grady, and thanks for having us all here today. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel with people who I know have a real expertise in this area of the law. And so what I'm going to try to do in my remarks is to really just set a very general stage. And then I'm going to allow the other panelists to really take you on a much deeper dive into these issues. And for me, I think what the real big takeaway is from the bigger picture of the status of our criminal system in this country is that we have a real serious problem. We are experiencing a crisis of incarceration in this country. The United States, as you might know, has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and by many times. I mean, it really dwarfs, our incarceration rate dwarfs the rate of nearly every other country in the world. And you might have heard the staggering statistic that while we have less than 5% of the world's population, we have over 25% of the world's prison population. And so that means a quarter of all of the people who are in detention in the world are detained within our borders. By the close of 2010, we had over 2.2 million people locked in cages in state and federal prisons and local jails. And that represents an increase of around 400% in US jail and prison population since 1971. 400% increase in our incarceration rate in just over 3 decades. And this balloon persists even though crime rates have significantly decreased. And when I personally look at the graphs, if you look at the increase in our prison or in our incarceration rates over the last 3 to 4 decades, I mean, it's really overwhelming. But it's even more overwhelming when you consider what that graph represents, the individual lives and the families and the communities that have been impacted by this rise in our prison population. And so this also means that a growing portion of our population has in fact had some interaction with the criminal justice system. And just recently, it's come to light that as many Americans now have criminal records as have college diplomas. And that's nearly 1/3 of the adult working age population. And so for these individuals that have criminal records, especially for individuals that have been incarcerated, they face serious obstacles to reintegrating into our communities. And some of those obstacles, which were discussed on the first panel, are actual collateral consequences that are in statute, things that make it more difficult in some cases to get subsidies, housing subsidies, things that can make it more difficult to access student loans, loss of driver's license. These are all collateral consequences in our statutes, but there's also the less formal discrimination that people face that can make it very difficult to get housing or to gain employment. And this type of discrimination against people who have criminal records is in fact legal in most states in the United States. And so we have this ballooning prison population that's easier and easier to get caught up in, but because of collateral consequences and because of discrimination, it's harder and harder for people to get out. And so we have a serious problem, really a problem of enormous proportions. But it's also a problem which, unfortunately, for many of us who are not touched by the criminal justice system, it's incredibly easy to ignore. Because if you look at this now really enormous population of people who are incarcerated in our country, they are overwhelmingly poor and they are disproportionately black. Nationally, blacks are nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites are, and Hispanics are nearly twice as likely to be incarcerated as whites. 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, and 1 of every 6 Latino males can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, and that's compared to 1 of every 17 white males. And nearly half of black males are arrested by the age of 23. And black people are 10 times more likely to be arrested for drug offenses, even though we know that whites are more likely to commit drug offenses. I'm curious, I mean, it's a really interesting timing for this panel, I think, as Professor Graby mentioned, and I'm just curious from those in the audience how many of you have watched the new documentary that's been released, 13th. I've seen a couple of heads shaking. For those of you who haven't seen it, I would really strongly recommend it. It's incredibly powerful. It was just released on Netflix, so fairly easy to access. And I would also, of course, recommend Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And the documentary lays out a really compelling and shockingly direct line from slavery to Jim Crow era segregation and violence to the politics of the war on crime and the war on drugs in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And this narrative is particularly striking when one considers that there are more black people under the control of prisons and corrections departments today than were ever enslaved by our country. And it's also striking when you consider the fact that punishment for a crime is an explicit exception to the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery. So there's an explicit exception to the ban on slavery for punishment for a convicted crime. Interestingly, the American American Correctional Association just this summer recommended that this exception clause actually be deleted from the 13th Amendment. And of course, we're here in the Granite State. And sometimes we Granite Staters like to think that we're exceptional and that we're not necessarily subject to national trends, and that we often avoid some of the problems that are plaguing the rest of the nation. And of course, New Hampshire's incarceration rates, is fairly low when you compare it to other states in the United States. But New Hampshire is not immune to these trends. Since the 1970s, the New Hampshire prison population has risen 9-fold, while the crime rate has actually dropped by more than 1/3. And so just to give a little context, our incarceration rate is now approximately on par with Russia's incarceration rate. When you do the international comparisons, I think it's really amazing. You are over 6 times more likely to be incarcerated in New Hampshire if you are black than if you are white. And New Hampshire also has a history of having some of the highest incarceration rates of Latinos in the country. So New Hampshire is not an exception. So we have a really serious national crisis. And as I said before, it's far too easy for those who are untouched by the system to ignore it. And so again, I want to ask another question. If you can give me a show of hands, how many of you in the audience are aware that we are in the middle of what is likely the largest prison strike in our nation's history? So that's actually not bad. That's not a bad showing of hands, because really, I think this prison strike has been incredibly underreported by mainstream news media. For those of you who weren't aware, since September 9th, we've seen strikes in as many as 50 prisons in at least 12 states across the country. And these strikes have consisted of work stoppages and hunger strikes and other actions through which prisoners are really trying to get their voice heard, and yet, in part due to how secretive the prison system is, it's largely being ignored by mainstream media. And I think, for me and for many, I think the glimmer of hope has been that there is a lot of conversation that's being had and some action that's being taken at high levels, at federal and state, to enact elements of reform to our criminal system. But what really personally strikes me after having worked on criminal reform for a couple of years now is that with all of this talk about reform And with all of the supposed bipartisan support for reform, and even with the realization I think that states have had that we cannot afford just financially to support the level of incarceration that we have created, the pace of reform is painfully and unacceptably slow. The political obstacles are just enormous. How many of you are you familiar with the Justice Reinvestment work that was done in New Hampshire around 2009, 2010? Right, so there was an effort to enact some significant reforms that would have led to a reduction in New Hampshire's prison population that was adopted in 2010 called Justice Reinvestment. It was going to address the way that we deal with parole. It had everybody on board, complete bipartisan support, near unanimous support when it passed the legislature. And then due to some very quickly, and it was actually working, our prison population for a year or so was actually decreasing. And then because of some very politically strategic fear-mongering that was done in the press, that entire set of criminal justice reforms was repealed, and New Hampshire's prison population then began to do along the steady increase that it had been doing before the reforms were implemented. And I want to be clear that this is also not a problem where it's going to be fixed just by one party taking power, a new party coming into power, because really this is a problem that was created by both Democrats and Republicans over a number of different administrations. And I just think it's important in our current political context to really recognize and accept that Bill Clinton, with the vocal support of his First Lady, presided over the largest increase in federal and state inmates of any president in American history. And that was due, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a direct line from the policies and the laws that he championed, and then that passed the legislature, things like 3 strikes and increasing sentencing and also increasing in funding for state prisons and police. And so, it's my belief that it's going to take more than just a shift in power from one party to the other to bring real change. And of course, there are real financial interests right now in keeping our incarceration rates up, both from private prisons, which our federal government is no longer using for its prison population, although it is still using private prisons to house immigrants. But certainly several states, use private entities to run their prisons. And of course, there are industries that benefit from artificially low prison labor costs. And so I think this is the part in my remarks where I'm supposed to get optimistic and show you the way forward. So I hope our panelists have maybe can fill, the rest of the panelists can fill that in. Because for me, I think the path forward is really, really far from clear. What I will say is that I think we need to do a heck of a lot more than just tinkering around the edges. Of course, we've been advocating for a long time for decriminalization of small amounts of marijuana because we know that the arrest rates are so incredibly disproportionate. I think it's 2.6 times more likely if you're black to be arrested for a marijuana possession in New Hampshire than if you're white. But that's not gonna have a huge impact. That's not even gonna make a dent on our incarceration rates. We need to do more than just drug and mental health courts, which can be important, but again, are not going to have a real significant impact on how many individuals are incarcerated. And we certainly are going to need more than speeches at the beginning of presidential campaigns. And so I think what we really are going to need, if we're going to make a dent in turning back this tide and getting incarcerations down, we're going to need radical change. And we're going to need it at the federal and state level. And we're going to need it at every point in the system, from the police to the courts to the prisons to reentry to how we deal with the underlying discrimination in our society. We're going to need deep and powerful movements like Black Lives Matter, All of Us or None, and the movement of prisoners striking as we speak across the country. Last month, Oakland hosted the first national conference of the formerly incarcerated convicted peoples and families. And these are really, really important and deep movements. And we're also going to need a little bit of a revolution within ourselves as individuals and with our society. And we're going to have to really rethink about how we approach the more than 70 million people in our country that have criminal histories. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Meckler.
Thank you, and Professor Graby, John, thank you for inviting me up from Boston. I came in last night, so I don't like driving, and I certainly don't like traffic, so. I want to talk about a single Supreme Court case. I know there are some law students, but also some teachers and interested citizens in the audience, and because Professor Graby asked me to speak about race, crime, and the Constitution. And my talk is going to focus on what the press calls stop and frisk practices by the police. Now, this occurs when police detain an individual who they suspect of criminal conduct and also allows frisking that individual for weapons when the officer reasonably suspects that the person may be armed and dangerous. And I also know I've got, 15, 20 minutes, so I'm going to keep an eye, and John will signal me. Now, prior to 1968, the Supreme Court interpreted the Fourth Amendment to our Constitution, which guarantees all of us the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. The court interpreted the Fourth Amendment to bar the police from physically or otherwise restraining a person without probable cause to believe that that person has committed a crime or was engaged in criminal activity. Now, things changed dramatically in 1968 when the court, and by the way, I'm not talking about the Roberts Court or the Rehnquist Court or even the Burger Court. I'm talking about the court of Chief Justice Earl Warren, who in my view was probably one of our greatest Chief Justices to sit on our Supreme Court bench. This was the Warren Court, which some of you I'm sure know was deemed to be a liberal court. The court, in a case called Terry versus Ohio, authorized the police to stop and frisk an individual when the police officer reasonably suspects, which is a lower standard than probable cause, when the police officer reasonably suspects that they are confronting an individual who is armed and dangerous. Now, a few of you may be asking, what does Terry have to do with race, crime, and the Constitution, the subject of this panel? Well, as others I'm sure know, police stop and frisk practices have been and remain one of the reasons behind the tension between minority communities and law enforcement. The best known, but by no means only example, of course, is what we've seen in New York City in the last few years. In 2013, in a civil action, a federal judge found that the stop and frisk practices of the New York City Police Department violated the Fourth Amendment rights of Black and Hispanic citizens. Pertinent to our discussion today, that judge commented on the resentment generated by NYPD's stop and frisk practices, and I'm quoting now the judge. The NYPD made 4.4 million stops between 2004 and June 2012. Over 80% of those 4.4 million stops were of Blacks or Hispanics. Those who are routinely subjected to stops are overwhelmingly people of color, and they are justifiably troubled to be singled out when many of them have done nothing to attract the unwanted attention. Some plaintiffs testified, and again, this was a civil case, not a criminal case. Some plaintiffs testified that stops makes them feel unwelcome in some parts of the city and distrustful of the police, close quote. Now, similar conclusions have been reached in many other urban jurisdictions nationwide. What former New York Times columnist Bobby Herbert wrote about the effect of stop and frisk practices in New York City is applicable to many places, and I'm quoting now Mr. Herbert. The stories are endless. If you go into a predominantly Black or Latino neighborhood, all you have to do is talk to young people at random. They will tell you how they are stopped, frisked, searched, threatened with arrest if they don't produce identification, cursed at, slapped around, spread eagle on the ground, thrown against walls, run off street corners, threatened with weapons, and inevitably some are falsely arrested, some are brutalized. Now, what countless government reports and independent commissions have found about the impact of stop and frisk should not come as a surprise. In 1968, when the court was considering whether the police should be allowed to do stop and frisk, on less than probable cause, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was, by the way, the same organization that challenged segregation in our public schools and resulted in Brown versus Board of Ed, the NAACP urged the court to consider several studies documenting the hostility that many blacks harbored against the police because of stop and frisk practices. In fact, before Terry was decided, a presidential commission appointed by President Johnson had documented the humiliation and anger felt by black males who were subject to stop and frisk tactics. Let me share with you just a few findings of that presidential commission. Quote, in many communities, stop and frisk tactics are a major source of friction between police and minority groups. Many minority group leaders strongly contend that field interrogations, which is another way of describing stop and frisk, field interrogations are predominantly conducted in slum communities, that they are used indiscriminately, and that they are conducted in an abusive and unfriendly manner. The commission has found that field interrogations, used sometimes in conjunction with aggressive preventive patrol, are often conducted on a broad-scale basis by many police departments. First, field interrogations are often conducted with little or no basis for suspicion. Second, field interrogations are sometimes used in a way which discriminates against minority groups, the poor, and the juvenile. For example, the Michigan State Survey found, on the basis of riding with patrol units in 2 cities, that members of minority groups were often stopped, particularly if found in groups, in the company of white people, or at night in white neighborhoods, and that this caused serious problems. Finally, field interrogations are frequently conducted in a discourteous or otherwise offensive manner, which is particularly irritating to the citizen. End of quote. Now, Terry ruled that stop and frisk by the police did not violate the Fourth Amendment. Now, again, prior to Terry, a police officer could not restrain you, physically or otherwise, unless that officer had probable cause. Terry changed all that. Now, the Supreme Court did not quarrel with the claim that stop and frisk practices were having a negative impact on minority communities and causing friction between those communities and law enforcement. While evidence of police abuse and harassment of minority citizens was acknowledged by the court, it was given a subordinate status to the court's main concern with police officer safety. Now, I submit to you today that the result in Terry was unfortunate for several reasons. First, long before Terry came to the court, the law was settled on the amount of evidence needed for a warrantless search. In a string of cases involving car searches, the court had left no doubt that the Fourth Amendment required that police have probable cause that evidence of a crime would be found before police could search inside a car. This principle of Fourth Amendment law was uncontroversial. If probable cause was the constitutional minimum to justify a car search, then surely, one would think, an equivalent amount of evidence is required before officers can undertake what Chief Justice Warren described as, quote, a careful exploration of the outer surfaces of a person's clothing all over his or her body in an attempt to find weapons, which is how the court described a frisk. Now, reasonable minds might agree that a car is not entitled to the same constitutional protection as a home. Clear thinking, however, recognizes that the respect and privacy associated with our bodies matches, if not exceeds, the privacy accorded automobiles. Second, police safety is obviously a compelling governmental interest. And let me say it again since I see the cameras on. Police safety is a compelling governmental interest. However, presenting the issue in Terry as a conflict between police safety and individual freedom misunderstands the reality of street encounters. And the chief is here and he can correct me if I'm wrong on this. No matter how the court ruled in Terry, police officers would continue frisking people they viewed as a threat to their safety. Once this pragmatic fact is conceded, the crucial question in Terry was who would bear the burden when officers search without probable cause? The government, which would suffer the suppression and loss of evidence, or the individual who was the target of a search forbidden by the Constitution. Finally, by relegating discriminatory law enforcement to a subordinate rank, in its Fourth Amendment analysis. The Terry Court made it easier for conservative justices to be equally unconcerned with similar evidence when raised in future cases. Now, I don't have time to talk about it now, but it's not surprising that in later cases involving Border Patrol investigations and the use of traffic stops for routine, the use of routine traffic stops to use as pretext for criminal investigations, what is otherwise known as racial profiling, right? The court downplayed or dismissed claims of discriminatory police behavior. Now, the ruling in Terry was a significant setback in the fight against bias policing, because evidence of police harassment of blacks was given little, if any, weight, and because the court had failed to adhere to traditional Fourth Amendment standards. Many years later, the routine experience of many, not all, but of many residents of urban areas show that the power to stop and frisk is still applied in a discriminatory manner against minority citizens. As a result of Terry and its progeny expanding its exception, police officers are now free to accost, detain, and search individuals on criteria that one federal appeals court has described as having, and I'm quoting now, a chameleon-like way of adapting to any particular set of observations, close quote. Now, while some in law enforcement deny it, in many places, it appears that race still has much to do with who is chosen for investigatory detentions and searches. Now, I see I've got a few moments. I'm going to end with the following observation. For some, Terry made the right choice. The need for police safety justified the loss of Fourth Amendment freedom. But those who have been the most vocal defenders of Terry tend to come from socioeconomic and racial and ethnic backgrounds that are predominantly free from police harassment. For many blacks and other disfavored groups, however, the Terry Court wrongly subordinated their Fourth Amendment rights to police safety. The court's failure to treat as dispositive the clear correlation between stop and frisk and the violation of Fourth Amendment rights served to remind blacks and other minorities of their second-class status in America. Thank you very much.
Morning, everybody. Morning. My subject, I love Fourth Amendment. I would love to talk about it a lot today. I actually had a conversation with the professor a little bit about Fourth Amendment beforehand. I find it fascinating. But when I see the title about race, crime, and the Constitution, I felt it was necessary to talk about the highly publicized events of police shootings of African American males and the vitriol and at times violence that has resulted towards police officers nationwide. I believe that this would be a good topic that I should talk about. I was having difficulty how to talk about it. I was having difficulty. Anytime you talk about race, and I just want to make a correction. That would make me like 70 years old. I wasn't the chief for 29 years. I was only chief for 7 years in Manchester.
I apologize.
But Manchester is a whole different world, in my opinion, than most municipalities in New Hampshire. The demographics are different. The issues are different. It is a true urban area. So as chief of police, part of my job was to make sure that I provided policing, provided quality of life, provided safety to everybody in the community. And that involved having to reach out to everybody in the community and learn about the people in your community. Now, I had several times I had discussions about race after the Ferguson in New York incidents. I got together with some community leaders, and we had a citywide discussion on race. And we had a pretty good mix. We had a pretty good mix of minorities as well as white people that were there. And we had a panel discussion, and then afterwards we did breakout sessions, just like here. And each breakout session had a police officer on it. And I thought it was very helpful. But to do that, you have to sustain it. You just can't do it after an incident. I remember when I was in Boston, growing up in Boston, I remember a young child would get killed in Boston, and then everybody would demand all these things, and then you don't hear about it anymore, and then there'd be another shooting. And I've learned that you have to make a sustained effort. Now getting back to what I was going to talk about, I was having trouble coming to words. As a chief of police, how could I talk about this? Last Monday, they had the director of the FBI, James Comey. He was speaking in San Diego at the International Association of Chiefs of Police. There was like 17,000 people that attend the conference. I might have that number wrong, but when I heard him speak, I watched it on YouTube, and I read his text. It's everything that I wanted to say that I didn't have the ability to come up with those words. And I'd just like to read you just a couple, and bear with me, please. He was talking about, it was titled, and you can get this on the internet, The True Heart of American Law Enforcement. It focused on what kind of leaders do we need in law enforcement in light of these shootings. I found what he was saying inspiring. This is part of it. The leaders we need know what good policing looks like. They know it because they lived it. Up close, respectful, disciplined, firm, fair, lawful, transparent law enforcement is what always worked best, even in neighborhoods with the most significant crime problems. The leaders we need understand that a combination of kindness and toughness, of humility and confidence, of decency and determination delivers the best results. The leaders we know their neighborhoods with the greatest need for police, and they know the people who live there. In particular, they know the history and journey of Black America. They know the hopes, the dreams, the disappointments, and the pain. They know the history of law enforcement's interaction with Black America because the Black people of America know it and remember it for reasons that make good sense. They know that African Americans, like Americans, want good policing because they know it is the path to safety and prosperity. The leaders we need understand that our challenges are multiplied by a narrative that is forming about American policing. It is a narrative that has formed in the absence of good information, in the absence of actual data, and it is this: biased police are killing Black men at epidemic rates. That is the narrative. It is a narrative driven by video images of real misconduct, possible misconduct, and perceived misconduct. It is a narrative given force by the power of empathy. It also a narrative pushed forward by the surprise and shock of civilians at seeing how fast and complicated police activity can be. The leaders we know that many people of goodwill in this country, decent, caring people, believe with all their hearts that the American law enforcement is using deadly force against Black people at epidemic levels. The leaders we know that Americans believe that because of those videos they see over and over again. To these Americans, people of goodwill and good hearts, each video becomes further proof of nationwide police brutality. People of goodwill are protesting because they believe there is an epidemic of police violence against Black people. Now, that is the way I feel as a chief of police. That is the way I feel I've led 2 police departments. Based on my experience, that is not happening. Based on what I know about American policing, that is not happening. But what I can tell you, some bad things are happening. And you heard from Devin, you heard that African American males are more likely to have contact with the police. African American males, we talk about incarceration. They're more likely to be involved in a deadly force situation with police. Now, I worry, and the director talked about this as well. What is this going to mean for policing? What is it going to mean for us going forward? One of the biggest things that I worry about, are officers going to follow their training? Are they going to hesitate because of all the publicity that's going on in regards to when to use deadly force? Or do they want to be that person on TV? Do they want to be called a racist? Now, I can tell you training in law enforcement is very, very important. Not just officer safety-wise, but training is very important because if you have a well-trained police department, you don't get many complaints. You don't get many police brutality complaints. Manchester, we responded, we averaged, when I was there, we made 6,000 arrests a year, and we responded to over 100 and something thousand calls. And we average about between 35 and 45, 50 complaints a year, which I think is pretty amazing. And the reason I say that, and the reason I believe that happens, is because of training. Constantly, you have to train your police officers. If you think about it, a police officer, I was 25 years old when I became a police officer. Now, we hire police officers as young as 21 years old. Think about the awesome responsibility that a police officer has. think about that. An officer can stop you, as we're talking about with Terry versus Ohio. An officer can detain you, an officer can arrest you. Under the right circumstances, he can legally take your life. Think about that responsibility we're giving to our young people. Now, one of the things that I worry about is that right now it's hard enough trying to find police officers that are qualified. It's a very hard process. And I believe that this is going to have an effect on all the men and women that want to be police officers, that are qualified, that want to be out there to help the community. They might find some other means to help the community. We already, like I said, there's already great competition to find police officers. Now, talking about officer safety, Officer Dan Doherty in 2012 was responding to a call where a person got out of a car in an intersection, and two undercover police officers saw what appeared to be a gun. So they called into dispatch saying, hey, they gave a description. So Dan Doherty headed over to the west side. He sees the person, tells him to stop. The person does, and he starts chasing him. As a result of that police chase, at that pursuit, the person goes around a corner. When he got around the corner, he unloaded his weapon on him. He just kept on shooting and shooting. That training that he had, as he was falling to the ground, you're getting shot, and training's all muscle memory. So he was still able to manipulate his gun out of his holster as he's falling, because in the police holster, they have safety features on it. You have to do a couple things before you can get the gun out to stop people from taking it. And he was able to return fire and to stop him from being killed. And so that's how important training is. I also want to touch on Michael Briggs. Michael Briggs was the type of person that you look for in a police officer. He was really involved in his community in Manchester. He would respond to calls, back officers up. He would stop to talk to kids. That was the type of person that you're looking for. Now, in 2006, his shift was over. And a call came on for a domestic, and he knew the people involved, possibly involving a gun. He ends up responding to it. He didn't have to. And when he responded, he was on a bike, and he told the person to stop. As he approached, the person just turned around and shot him. What's ironic, and this is what gets me when you see all these films and people talking about police, the brutality. Ironically, 3 years earlier, the person that shot and killed him was a victim of a gunshot, and he rendered first aid and possibly saved his life. So that's the type of police officers that are out there. When you look at the tragedy that was in Dallas, what really struck me is what kind of police officers do we want? There you had Black Lives Matter, you had this big protest there. A lot of people were saying very not nice things to the police officers that were there working to protect them. And then once the shooting started, what I thought was very moving was this African-American woman who was very excited and was talking about how when the shooting started, an officer got on top of her to shield her. That's what policing is about. And that is the policing that I know. That's the policing that I know in New Hampshire. Now, it's already hard enough now to find minority candidates. There's such a competition. Now in Manchester, I'm a strong believer that your police force, the face of your police force, should match the face of your community. In Manchester, our demographics are different than the rest of New Hampshire. We are 86% white, approximately 4% black, and 8% Hispanic. But we have people from all over the world. We are a refugee relocation center. We have people from all parts of Africa. We have people from the Middle East that were relocated here, people from India, Burma, you name it. We have people that live in Manchester. So policing is different in Manchester. When we're talking about facts, when you heard me read what Director Comey was talking about, there's not facts. I just want to tell you a little bit about law enforcement. There are 900,000 sworn police officers in the United States. There's an estimated 1,165,000 violent crimes that occur in 2014. As you heard, there's been a decrease. A total of 1,439 police officers died in the line of duty during the past 10 years. An average of 1 death every 61 hours a police officer is killed. There were 123 law enforcement officers killed in line of duty in 2015 total. So far for this year, fatalities for police, it's up to 105 compared to last year in October, it was 96. Now, it's easy to say that, it's an easy way out to say that more black people, African Americans, are in jail or get arrested because they're more likely to commit crimes. That's not the answer. That is not what we should be looking at. We shouldn't be concentrating, in my opinion, we shouldn't be concentrating in talking about these police shootings. Don't get me wrong, you should talk about them, but it's not the issue, the underlying issue. And everything that Devin had said, until a couple things at the end, I agreed with you. But I agree with it. If you look at it, how many people are incarcerated in our country? It's incredible. Then when you look at how many African Americans, they're nearly 1 million of the total 2.3 million incarcerated population. They are, as you heard, incarcerated 6 times the rate of whites. There's a problem there. And then if you go further, if you look at the poverty rate in this country, the poverty rate for the population as a whole is 13.5%. The rate varies by race. Blacks have the highest poverty rate at 24.1%. Non-Hispanic whites, the lowest at 9%. The poverty rate for blacks and Hispanics is more than double that of non-Hispanic whites. To me, we failed as a country. Why is this still happening? Why can't we come up with a solution? Now, back in 2008, I don't care which side of the aisle, I don't care who you voted for, what race you were of. When President Obama got elected, I felt almost like a relief. I felt like, okay, we can maybe have some change. But I think things have gotten worse, and I'm not laying the blame on President Obama, but we had a president of the United States that is African American, and we're still having no change. So what do we have to do as a country to change these things? Now, police officers, they're the ones that are out on the street. They're the ones that are dealing with all the social ills of society. They're the ones that are dealing with racism. They're the ones that are dealing with mental health issues, the heroin addiction issues. They're the ones that are a lot of times the brunt of those social problems. They're the ones that people see. Now, I have a good friend that I talk to. I always try to get different opinions, and we debate a lot and we talk. And he tells me that he knows that some African Americans see the police as an occupying force. And that's a pretty powerful thing to hear in this day and age, that people feel that way about a police department in this country. So we have a lot of work to do, and I think our country has failed miserably, and it just keeps on getting worse and worse. And I think a bigger problem ultimately is the socioeconomic divide in this country. That it's not going to be so much about race. I think the big problems we're seeing is about the disparity of socioeconomic levels. Now, New Hampshire, I think New Hampshire is different. I agree that the problems you're seeing across the country do come into New Hampshire, but we're small enough that if we get a big enough group of people together, you can affect real change. There are some good things going on in New Hampshire. What we're trying to do in law enforcement and partnering with other people to try to better police and make everybody believe that the police department is their police department where they live. Now, in New Hampshire, there's something called disproportionate minority contact, DMC. Yeah, every state is required to participate in this program. It's to develop and implement delinquency prevention and systems improvement strategies. Basically, it's to combat the disproportionate amount of minority youth that are in the juvenile justice system. Now, in New Hampshire, we've been meeting, we've been doing this for a while. I'm actually proud to say I'm the co-chairman of the New Hampshire committee. And we have subcommittees in Manchester, Nashua, Rochester. And the issue isn't that great in New Hampshire. It is an issue. What they do is they look at 9 points from a juvenile being taken into custody all the way to detention, and they examine those points to try to find out why is it that the minority youth are getting incarcerated or detained at that rate. But instead of just waiting, instead of just talking about that, what we decided to do is we wanted to get involved with trying to help the situation as far as police and relations with children, kids, juveniles. So Connecticut State Police had a program where they trained police officers, and it's called Effectively Interacting with Youth. And it involved, for the most part, dealing with minority youths, letting us know where they come from, you know, what is their point of view. So we sent officers in Manchester there. Nashua sent some officers, and ultimately we sent officers that were trained to be trainers. And a lot of our officers are taking it. The DMC coordinator, Andrew Smith, he now teaches diversion and, diversity training at the academy. And we also are expanding that program where we were trained. We are now getting involved with the kids. In Manchester and Nashua, they both police departments worked with youth, and we came up with these videos. It's a scenario where officers show up at a variety store for a loud music complaint, and the first video is how the officers went right after the kids. Just went right out, what are you doing here? And then the kids reacted. Then the second video was the officers went there and they acted like they're supposed to, professional, and treat everybody with respect, and it was a different result. And there's a training program that goes with it. We started doing it in Manchester at the school department. We started doing it with 8th graders. The Nashua is now doing that with the Boys and Girls Club. Now that I'm in Portsmouth, we're going to start our own DMC committee there, and we're going to be doing that as well. And the next step we want to do is we want to provide training to kids how you should act when stopped by the police. What is the most effective way to deal with the police when you're stopped? And we're going to do, the scenario that we're thinking about doing is a car stop. And that is one of the biggest complaints that you get is, issues involving car stops. So, the other things that are going on in New Hampshire. When I was in Manchester, everything you did, you had to do it in a sustained manner. You had to keep it going with community outreach. I started a community advisory board, and that community advisory board was so we could get people from all over the city, from all different walks of life, all different racial backgrounds, to come in, and we met once a month and to talk about their concerns. Now, we started doing that. After about a year, a lot of trust was gained. After about a year, we started something called the Youth Leadership Academy. And I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with different board of, I can't remember what the organization, but anyway, what we do is we go to, we take the kids one time, one day they get trained about government. We'll have a state senator would participate, an alderman would participate. We talked, then another time it was about going to court. A judge would talk to them, a prosecutor and a defense attorney. We'd go to Channel 9. They can learn about the media. We had John Clayton, who's a historian, talk about the history of Manchester, so they know where they live, what the history is, that it does have a history. It is a city of immigrants. And when the people that go there, they were from all walks of life. We had white kids, black kids, we had Asian kids, and afterwards they would go to City Hall, and in front of the alderman and the mayor, they would get their diploma. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get kids to feel like this is their city, this is their police department, and we want them to be advocates when they get older. We want them to know how to advocate for themselves. Refugee welcoming. We would, when refugees came in, we would, a lot of these people, when they come from out of from a place from other United States, they're there because they're afraid of the police. So we have to do an outreach. If you need us, you can talk to us. We try to be a resource for them. Community meetings. In Manchester, I could have a community meeting. I could be at the Chamber of Commerce. That was the two words I was looking for before. But Chamber of Commerce, I was on the board of directors. In the morning, I could have a meeting for the board of directors. And then at night, I could be at a meeting for undocumented immigrants at a church rectory. You have to reach out to the whole community. And again, it has to be a sustained effort. You have to keep on doing it. We have a police athletic league. It's right in the middle of the inner city, and it is a refuge. Kids go in there, they feel safe, they have positive interaction with police officers. They learn, a lot of kids that go there never had a sense of accomplishment, so they start the athletic program. It's not about boxing, it's not all about judo, it's not all about wrestling. What it's about is getting kids a chance to be able to accomplish something, to start something and then move forward and progress. And it's been very successful. We've had kids come out of there. They now are working, and they come back and they give back to where they started. We just had a $1.6 million, I believe it was, the renovation of the building. So now we're going to have an industrial kitchen. We're going to teach inner city kids, minority kids, how to cook, so they can get an idea how to prepare a meal and to eat healthy. These are the type of things that, as a police department, you need to do. You need to know that you're a resource to the community. We also started doing a program. There's a school in Manchester. It's an elementary school, Beach Street School, and it is a minority-majority elementary school. I went in there to read to some kids when I first became chief, and as I'm sitting there, all these little kids, minority kids, are pointing at me saying, "You arrested my brother, you arrested my sister, or you did this or that," and I was blown away by that was the view growing up that people have. So we have to get to the kids earlier, and so what we started doing something called Cops and Kids, where once a year we go to each elementary school, we bring all the bells and whistles, we do a K-9 demonstration, and then the kids come out and they are able to go to a station, a motorcycle, SWAT van, crime scene van, police car, motorcycle, ATVs. And groups of kids at each station will move around and they'll talk to the police officers. And if we do that from kindergarten to 5th grade, that's 6 years of positive interaction with the youth. Now, what other things that are important? If you're going to police your community, a minority that involves a minority, we updated our immigration SOP. So if we stop somebody or for a minor motor vehicle violation, we're not reporting them to ICE. We're not detaining them. If they need to come in to ask a question or to get help, we're not asking them for identification as far as any kind of citizenship papers. What we do is if they get arrested for something that involves a danger or a felony, then we will report them. We designed a police department. We made a new police department, and we designed it because we wanted people to feel it was their police department. We made a community room on the first floor, and every time we have a community meeting, we have a big map of the world. And if somebody comes from a different part of the world, they'll put a pin on where they come from. So we have a lot of pins in there. It just demonstrates about how diversity is coming to New Hampshire. In the school system, over 90 languages are spoken, different languages are spoken. In Police Commission, now, in Manchester, the Police Commission does not really have any authority. They're an advisory board. Traditionally, the police commissioners have always been white men and women. I don't need advice from white men and women. I'm a white man. So I lobbied the mayor, and we got an African-American gentleman who was a community activist, still is, and a Latino woman who is a community activist, and got them on the board. And it really helped because you get a point of view you're never going to get. The point I'm trying to make in New Hampshire is that we can learn from everything that's going across the country, and we can come up with a solution before it becomes a problem. We can learn from other people's mistakes, and I really do believe that, and I found that I've been very successful in my career by when you talk to people, you have more in common than you have apart. Everybody wants the same. When I'm talking about when I went to those two meetings, if you ask anybody at the Chamber of Commerce meeting, and if you ask anybody that was at that church rectory, they all want the same thing. They want safety, they want their kids to get a good education, they want jobs, and they want to enjoy their lives. And as a police department, I think that is the main job that we have, is to help them accomplish those things. But I'm encouraged by New Hampshire. We had a discussion last night about how an election in New Hampshire, your vote means something. It's a swing state, and your vote needs something. It's the same thing here. Your voice means something. We're a small enough state. So I believe we can head off these problems. Now, I was going to give you a bunch of other stats, and I was going to talk about crimes and things like that. But when I was doing a little research, this is what amazed me, and this is just ancillary to what we're talking about. Everybody keeps on talking about Chicago, the homicide rate, and everything going on there. I'll just read you this article that we just came out. A shooting on Monday, October 17th, has brought Chicago's homicide number to at least 600 in 2016, according to the Chicago Tribune. The year isn't over, and that number is already 190 increase from Chicago homicides in 2015. At least 3,475 people have been shot in the Chicago area. A person is shot in Chicago every 2 hours. A person is murdered every 11 and a half hours. As of June 29th, and this is another stat, I don't know why I did that, but as of June 29th, 2016, according to the U.S. Department of Defense casualty website, there were 4,424 total deaths, including both killed in action and non-hostile, and 31,952 wounded in action, as a result of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So if you were to multiply, and I had the math somewhere here, but if you were to multiply, Iraqi Freedom's been going on for 13 years. So those numbers I just gave you, if you multiplied them in Chicago, it far outnumbers how many people we had killed in Iraq. That is something that we ignore. Why are we allowing this to happen in our cities? So that's just food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Very, very interesting. I have a number of questions here to prompt further discussion. I'll grab a few more. Thank you. Thank you. And again, we'll have lunchtime conversations. I won't be able to get through all of these, obviously, but we can do this. So, one question is: should there be higher screening education requirements for police officers? Is it easy enough to get a bad apple off the force? So those are, I guess, two different questions. You have a reaction on that?
I can speak for what happens in New Hampshire. You have to take a written test, then a physical agility test. Then you go through an interview. Then after you go through an interview, you get a written psych test. You get a in-person test with the doctor examination. You get a medical test, eye test. Then what's unique in New Hampshire and in Manchester and Portsmouth as well, you give a polygraph. And part of the questions that in your application that you're asked, do you have any animus or discriminatory thoughts towards any group? And then when you're asked that in the polygraph, they'll say, were you truthful? One of the questions, were you truthful in your packet and in all the questions that you answered? So we hope that would screen people out of there. But keep in mind, there are 900,000 police officers in the United States. And you're always, in any industries, you're always going to get some bad people. I've not seen too many, but they're out there in New Hampshire. There have been some in the past. Anybody watching those videos, there's no excuse for that. That is brutality. That was a crime, a lot of those videos that we watch. But we do have a pretty stringent testing.
What is the, somebody also asked, what is the ethnic and racial makeup of the Manchester and Portsmouth police departments, if you know off the top of your head?
Predominantly white. And we, in Manchester, I can speak to, make all kinds of efforts to recruit minority candidates. We've had success having more come to take the test. We've had, we wanted to get more people, so we, in conjunction with Southern New Hampshire University, we have a seminar right before the test to explain what the test involves, and also to let people know what it takes to be a police officer, the qualifications we're looking for, as well as what the things you should and shouldn't do that can disqualify you. But it's very hard to recruit minority candidates, and the current climate in the country, I'm sure, is not going to help.
Great, thank you. This is for Professor Macklin. The intent of the colloquially called Terry Pat or Terry Stop is to protect police officers from weapons. How do the courts reconcile this with the fact that, at least in many instances, the evidence produced from these searches, is not a weapon, but is rather drugs that give rise to drug-related offenses?
It's a very good question. The reason why the narcotics or drugs that are admissible is because if the Terry frisk is valid, then anything that is found as a result of that frisk is also going to be admissible. Now, if they go outside of the scope or the permissible scope of a Terry frisk, then they cannot use any evidence that they find if they go outside the scope of it. Now, there was a proposal back in the 70s that said if they are validly frisking you and they don't find weapons but they find drugs, for example, or other evidence of a crime, that shouldn't be admissible. Because again, in theory, the whole point of a Terry frisk is to protect the officer's safety. That proposal went nowhere.
There was actually a case, like, going back in my memory, I think it was Dickinson versus Minnesota. And they talked about
No, Dickerson came out the way, I think, law enforcement. What happened, Dickerson involved a situation where there was a lawful Terry frisk, and in the course of the frisk, the officer felt something and he moved it around in his fingers. That was admissible because he didn't say immediately he had probable cause, it was contraband. Right. Now, the upshot of Dickerson, in Dickerson itself, you're right, the evidence was suppressed, but the upshot of Dickerson now is that when officers are frisking and they feel something, they say, oh, I had probable cause that it was contraband or it was this or it was that. And so as Justice Scalia, who's no softy on the Fourth Amendment, said, what in effect we're doing, and Scalia voted with the majority, what in effect we're doing is we're allowing a frisk for evidence. Mm-hmm. But Dickerson basically applies the plain view.
And they called it the plain field.
Right, the plain field, plain touch to Terry frisk.
Yeah, obviously Justice Scalia remains much in the news, given the vacancy on the court and his passing earlier this year. But it's a fact, is it not, Professor Macklin, that Justice Scalia often broke ranks with the other so-called conservative justices, and
I wouldn't say often.
Not often. Okay,
no,
overstates it. Okay.
You're right. I think it's slightly over. Occasionally, yeah. Scalia was not. I have a student in my criminal procedure class this semester who, let's just say, is very liberal. And every time Scalia does break ranks, I look at her and smile and say, Scalia was right, correct? And,
right.
And she
turned the screw, yeah.
But no, Scalia, he was consistent. He was about interpreting the Constitution the way the text requires, and he wanted clear rules.
Right.
And sometimes that helped the individual, and sometimes it didn't.
Right. This is for Attorney Chafee. Which states or jurisdictions, if any, seem to you to be out in front in terms of some of the reforms that you think are necessary? Are there any communities that, from your perspective, are making improvements and headed in the right direction?
I think you are seeing, especially at the state level, I think you are seeing a lot of positive reform. I think I'm really interested in what's going on in California, where you have seen a lot of reform that's primarily occurred through ballot initiative, not in fact through the legislature. So, and you have another, I believe there's another initiative on the ballot just this year. So I think, looking to the direction that California is going is interesting, but I also want to say that some of the most interesting reforms have also been taken place in what you would traditionally consider red states, where the prison population was so large and so costly that, primarily, and the way that sort of Republicans in states like Texas has framed their attempts at criminal justice reform has largely been to ease the financial burden. And so I think, we have seen positive movement, but when you look at what is a 2.9%, I think there was a 2.9% decrease, I want to say, since 2009, and you compare that with the 400% increase from 1971, I find it depressing, to be honest. And it makes me wonder, what is the kind of real radical reform that we need to really make a significant dent? And I don't know the answer to that.
We have a question about the heroin epidemic that many are aware that New Hampshire is, and many states are suffering. Heroin is a huge issue in New Hampshire. It also has a very different demographic than many other types of drugs, particularly its high use among middle-class whites. How can community efforts taken to resolve the heroin crisis be used in other, with respect to other types of drugs? And I think the assumption here is that because it's having an impact on a more politically empowered part of the state, it's receiving perhaps more attention than other types of drug issues is. And is there hope that in responding to the heroin epidemic, we might model some behavior that would be more broadly helpful?
Oh, I can certainly.
Yeah, and I'll chime in after.
Okay. I disagree with the underlying premise that when crack cocaine hit New Hampshire in the late 80s, early 90s, it had the same effect as far as being an epidemic. Like people were losing their jobs. They were putting themselves in bad situations, and we thought it was. And then the whole thing about crack babies, everybody's worried. We were worried about that, but that faded away. The difference between heroin and crack is the addiction is so much more insidious, and what's going on with what it's being mixed with, we're getting so many deaths from it. That's why it rises. That's why the response to it is so great. And we were caught, law enforcement and as well as treatment side of things, we were caught off guard with not enough resources to deal with it. There weren't enough treatment centers. When somebody wanted to get help, there was no help to get, and that is what really exacerbated the problem.
So, I think I'm of two minds. Part of me is just depressed, and then part of me thinks that there is some opportunity. So I'll sort of express both. First of all, I think it's important to recognize, obviously, it took years and years and years for the crack powder cocaine disparity to be, at least brought somewhat into line on a federal level, and there has been reform in that area. New Hampshire, by the way, still has a very significant disparity in our laws. We actually worked with a couple of legislators to get that corrected in the face of all of the empirical evidence. And we're unsuccessful. So, if anybody wants to make a second go, let me know. But I do think people are understandably frustrated, and I think when people, why is it that the heroin epidemic in New Hampshire is being treated like the public health issue that it should be treated? And I think that framework is helpful, and I think we can use it. And for me, when I talk about marijuana reform or decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana, given the incredible disparities in arrest rates in our state, I say this is completely in line with, Senator or Mr. Representative, with the way that you have approached the heroin epidemic, because you're treating it as a public health issue and not a criminal issue. But to be honest, what is the face of the heroin epidemic in our state? And I think we need to be honest with ourselves about whether or not, the fact that that face is predominantly white has an impact on the way that we feel that our state needs to respond.
I just want to comment on one part of that. Sure. being involved when it first started, and we started seeing the numbers and crimes go up, and then we started seeing all the overdose deaths. I believe that per ratio, we are the third highest in the nation for overdose deaths. And during the crack epidemic in New Hampshire, the vast majority of the people that were addicted were white. And so I understand things are different in the other parts of the country, and I don't deny that. But I believe that our response to this is truly is a safety response with fentanyl and what they're lacing it with. When somebody buys a finger of cocaine, of heroin, what they do is they'll take heroin, they'll take then what they mix it with, could be fentanyl, and they put it in a mixer. And then they put it into what it calls a finger. They put it into, it could be a balloon or a part of a glove. And then afterwards, when somebody takes that heroin and they prepare it to shoot up, you don't know what part of, you could be getting all fentanyl, you could be getting all heroin, you could be getting whatever else is in there. So that is why we have so many overdose deaths, is because of what it is being laced with. So, and it's affecting everybody, every walk of life, every town, every city, and that is why I think we're getting that response.
And I think it's positive. I mean, I think the Narcan reform was positive. I think the 911 immunity call laws reforms that were largely supported by law enforcement were positive. And I think the fact that the state is taking a public health framework, and with the support of law enforcement in taking that framework, is positive. Hopefully next year we'll get needle exchange. We can talk about that later.
I'm all in favor for needle exchange. Absolutely. If you see what happened in Indiana with
Yep.
this, so.
It looks like we have time for maybe one more here. There's a question about for-profit prisons, and I don't know if anyone has, wants to take this, but for-profit prisons have been recorded as denying prisoners basic human rights such as medical treatment. Are there statistics indicating that private for-profit prisons are worse than public institutions in this way? And then more specifically, is there any indication that the burden is being felt disproportionately by prisoners of color? And I don't know if anyone knows either. But.
I'm sorry, so the question is?
Well, the question is, first of all, is there evidence that abuses, failures to honor basic rights are more prevalent in private prisons than in publicly funded institutions? And then secondly, if so, is there a suggestion that it's falling disproportionately on prisoners of color?
So, does anybody else want to? So, I mean, I know that we just recently fought off private prisons in the state in New Hampshire successfully. Right after Governor Hassan came into office, she made very clear, through collaboration with a sort of review committee, that we would not be bringing private prisons to the state of New Hampshire. So we worked a little bit on that issue, and when we were doing that work, I mean, I think the answer to the question is yes. Like, there are definitely tons of examples of horribly run correctional facilities by private prisons, and we do a lot of work with the ACLU National Prison Project. Does a lot of work in this areas, and have filed a number of lawsuits. I mean, we're talking about incidents of guards who are probably understaffed and underpaid, using prisoners as almost like gladiators for entertainment and violence. And so there are, I think, a number of examples throughout the country of real deprivation, and including medical failure to provide medical treatment, food that has maggots in it, like really, really horrible violations. And certainly the ACLU feels that we have seen those violations more frequently and more egregiously in privately run facilities. Which is why we oppose the use of privately run facilities, in addition to the fact that it creates an economic incentive for these corporations to actually be out there lobbying your elected officials to not engage in serious consideration of criminal reform, because that cuts against their bottom line. I think the question to ask is not necessarily, does it have a greater impact on prisoners of color, but does it have a greater impact of people of color in our country? And because the prison population is so disproportionately black, the answer to that is absolutely yes. yes, it does have a disproportionate impact. And it's really, really hard, and I think you're seeing with the prison strike, to get that information sort of out there, to get those experiences told, because prisons are secretive places, and it's hard to get that message out. I actually have could I ask a question of Commissioner Macklin? Is it okay if you choose to accept it? Where do you see the Fourth Amendment going? Where are we going now? Oh, what's going to happen with the new court? I mean, we've got potentially a really, the court could transform significantly in the coming years. Where would you like to see it go?
I'm not sure the audience wants to hear where I would like to see it go, but I think, as we all know, it's going to depend on who wins the presidential election, because it's my sense that the next president, whoever she or he may be, will have at least, well, we'll have three appointments in the next term. Frankly, I think Justice Ginsburg should step down. I don't say that because I have any problems with any of her rulings. I think, she's getting up there in age. The same is true with Justice Breyer. They've been on the court for a long time. I think what happens is the justices, once they're on the court, I mean, it's pretty heady. It's a heady job, and they think no one else can do it as well as they can. But I think that, particularly if Hillary Clinton is elected president, as I think will happen, Ginsburg will step down probably shortly. So if I had any power or authority, I think Breyer as well. Now, that said, depending on what happens with the Senate, and we've heard Senator McCain most recently, although his spokesperson kind of walked back from it. It wouldn't surprise me, on the other hand, if there are some members of the Republican caucus who are not going to accept or will not confirm a likely President Hillary Clinton, as opposed to Bill Clinton, appointee. So, but the Fourth Amendment, it's an area that is always with us, especially in a technologically advanced society, which we live in, because what the Fourth Amendment protects us against are unreasonable governmental searches and seizures, and almost many things the government does can be considered a search or a seizure, whether it's DNA sampling, how we use our computers, our cell phones. I mean, you name it. Surveillance is increasing and will continue to increase, in my opinion. So, and the problem is, and I will stop here, the problem is oftentimes when the Supreme Court hears these cases, they involve criminal suspects. What the court often does not see is how their rules impact upon innocent individuals. Because once the court says the police can do whatever's being challenged against the person who's suspected of crime, and it's not a search, for example, then they can do it against all of us. And that's the impact that is felt among all citizens, but these cases typically get litigated in a context in which a criminal suspect is the one bringing the challenge. And so people think, oh, well, the Fourth Amendment is about guilty people. In fact, Justice Scalia once said that, that the Fourth Amendment is associated with criminals, when in fact the Fourth Amendment protects all of us.
Yeah, and an involving doctrine makes it very, very difficult for somebody who's innocent of a crime, who wants to bring a civil rights action, to complain about an unlawful search and seizure.
Right.
It's a real
area.
uphill uphill battle to get a remedy. So, well, this has been fantastic. Thank you all for joining us today. Okay.